Hi, class. Welcome back to Biomedical Ethics. Today we'll be talking about genetically modifying animals as well as the community and social debate surrounding GMOs. And this is a particularly hot topic, and it fits in well with our weekly theme. So, throughout the week, we've been discussing the ethical and social implications of biotechnological applications. On Monday, we talked about cloning and how this new technological innovation hitting the stage in a big way in 1996 impacted not only of reproductive technologies, but also societal views of said technologies. And then on Wednesday, we looked in depth at the designer baby discussions and concerning whether or not we should modify our children, and if so, how. And today we'll be finishing up this week by discussing the GMO debate. Just as a note, I am the bioethicist associated with the Functional Genomics Initiative, and so we look at this topic in great detail. So the talk will be structured as follows, or the lecture will be structured as follows today. First, we'll be discussing the stakeholder debate of biotechnology applications. Then we'll be looking at whether or not it is a scientific literacy problem. Many scientists and leaders in the field, and especially in genomics, often couch the societal pushback to GMOs, or even the push for labeling, as built on this foundation of scientific illiteracy. Well, if the public knows more about the issue, then that will simply solve the problems. But is it a scientific illiteracy problem? And are there other factors influencing said pushback? So we'll be exploring that. And then we'll go over, or we'll spend a little bit of time looking at the most common value-laden concerns associated with genetically modifying animals, and then I'll point you towards a couple of interesting case studies, such as there was even a Kickstarter, but modifying plants and animals to glow, for example. So, for the past 2 decades, there's been a highly contentious public debate concerning biotechnology applications, and we saw that throughout the week with the pushback concerning the development of IVF last week. Fast forward 1996, cloning, Dolly hits the stage. There is a huge discussion that was prompted with this development. Fast forward even more into backtrack 1980s, when we really started modifying plants on the large scale. And then we see throughout this entire, but then fast forward to the Aqua Advantage salmon hitting the market. And so we're seeing an ever increasing societal discussion concerning what applications are acceptable and should we be genetically modifying our breeds and seeds. Now, for the last 20 years, the debate has become dangerously polarized as it continues to be actively discussed in the public sphere. And this is not surprising. Just to give you just an overview, these are just some of the headlines that I pulled recently from popular news venues, just to illustrate the amount of ink that's being spilled on GMOs. We have, what is a genetically modified crop? So we have ontological concerns. How do we define it? Can we separate genetic modification from selective breeding? Is there a distinction here? Is there not, right? Are GMO foods safe? What are the individual impacts here? Are they benefiting or are they harming populations? With an eye on hunger, scientists see promise in genetic tinkering of plants. What are the larger societal impacts? Can it help us address large or problems or wicked problems, so to speak? Wicked problems are simply problems that are complicated, and that require a wide range of expertise to address, such as addressing hunger issues. Are GMOs harmful to our food sovereignty or our ability to make food choices? Monsanto sued small farmers to protect seed patents, right? What are the larger economic and rights impacts. An aqua bounty should genetically modified or genetically engineered salmon be labeled? Will that help ensure that consumer autonomy is protected? The environmentalist case in favor of GMO foods, and we've seen many against GMO foods as well. What are the larger environmental impacts? How does GMOs impact, say, communities that rely on, say, the harvesting native populations of salmon, for example, concerning aqua bounty? And that's been a huge issue, especially in the Pacific Northwest, with the rise of genetically modified salmon. All of these headlines point to different concerns or different benefits of dealing with genetically modifying our foodstuffs, and in particular well, this is crops, but our seeds and breeds. All right. So, due to these wide ranging concerns, and as you can see, they're all over the map, it's commonly argued that pushback is at least partially due to scientific illiteracy. For example, questions concerning safety can be answered scientifically. So if we look at this, we'll say, oh, well, questions concerning whether or not something is harmful, etc. What are the potential impacts? What are the potential benefits and harms? We do research on these things to ensure that we know what the potential environmental and individual impacts are, etc. And so all we need to do is ensure that consumers are abreast of this knowledge, understand and know this knowledge, have access to the research. And then this will alleviate concerns. That's the scientific illiteracy position concerning a GMO pushback. Now, Pamela Ronald, the great plant geneticist, argued that GMOs highlights a perfect storm, and this is why we're seeing pushback. So there's a general distrust of corporations, especially when we talk about Monsanto, quote unquote, suing farmers. I'm not saying whether they did or not. I'm just saying that illustrates this general distrust of corporations. When you connect that to agricultural illiteracy, less than, or approximately, I should say, 1% of the US population is involved in agriculture. And as such, 99% of the population, at the maximum, may not have a working knowledge of how agriculture works, and especially of agricultural products and modification, the genetic modification of animals. We tend to do this for food products, right? Although we'll talk about the many different modification projects. And then there's also group loyalty. If you're in a group that's like, oh, I'm not sure about this whole GMO thing, you're going to want to sort of stick with your guns and do what everyone else is doing. And so she argues that these three sort of thrusts that we're seeing or trends that we're seeing in the social milieu has created a perfect storm of to sow conflict concerning whether or not we should modify our animals and our plants. So, is it a matter of scientific illiteracy? Is it? Well, let's look at the research. A survey conducted by the Food Policy Institute at Rutgers found that 48% of consumers who took the survey were unknowledgeable about GMOs. Only 48% knowing that GMOs were available in supermarkets, and 38% believing that they have most likely consumed a GMO product. Now, can anyone tell me what percentage of products are genetically modified or contain genetically modified ingredients in the supermarket? Now, I know you can't answer me because this is a recorded lecture, but it's well over 90%. In fact, if I'm remembering correctly, I think it's sitting currently around 95 to 97%. Right? So 48% know that only 48% of consumers, at least from this study, know that GMOs are available, and 31% believes that they most likely consumed a GMO product, even though we're seeing a proliferation of said products in the supermarket. In addition, the majority of participants self-rated their knowledge to be poor, with 48% saying they knew very little, 16% felt that they knew nothing, and 30% argued that they know a fair amount, with just 5% of the population stating that they know a good amount about GMOs. Now, in addition, where you get your information matters. So, a 2015 survey on consumer perceptions of genetically engineered foodstuffs looked into this. And they supported the Rutgers study, basically saying yes, consumers worldwide, not just in the United States, have a limited understanding of GMO products and indeed misconceptions. But they also looked at where people are obtaining the information that they do have about GMOs, largely from the media, the internet, and other news sources, not scientific sources, so to speak. All right. And then to continue looking at this worldwide trend, a more recent 2019 study that analyzed surveys from the United States, France, and Germany suggested that 5% that argued that they knew a great deal about genetically modified organisms sort of think that they do know a lot about the particular topic, but they actually, when their knowledge is tested, actually know the least. So here it's important to recognize that scientific illiteracy is an important part of improving public views on products. But ignorance of being ignorant here could be fueling the debate. I think I know more than I do. So solving the scientific illiteracy problem here might not be enough to address concerns over GMOs. So those most vocal may not be interested in obtaining more information. And this points to other factors driving discussions. And in fact, bioethicists such as Paul Thompson have argued that the polarization of the public GM debate might stem from normative or value conflicts. And we're in a bioethics class, so you're like, oh man, I knew where this was going, rather than a lack of empirical evidence. And this is called the problem of shifting proof. So, whilst addressing scientific illiteracy is part of the solution, there are key normative and ethical concerns associated with the genetic modification of breeds and seeds, although we're primarily focusing on breeds. So I will post this. This is just a Discovery News case study discussing Aqua Advantage salmon. And I will be asking the students in the Friday lecture, what are the benefits of genetically engineered animals? What are potential harms, direct and indirect? So hopefully you'll have a few minutes to go over that. So there are some potential benefits, and the potential benefits include the following, and I am sure that your fellow students would have recognized or identified these. It can greatly improve productivity. You could genetically modify seeds, for example, so that you can plant more corn, wheat, and soy. Concerning Aqua Advantage salmon and animal modifications, you can modify animals so that they produce more foodstuffs in a shorter amount of time. So as you would have seen from that video, the modified salmon can actually grow to market weight in a fraction of the time as than non-modified salmon. So you're increasing the productivity here. You could also utilize said technology to improve the overall welfare of animals. So for example, UC Davis is working on a project where they're modifying dairy cattle so that they no longer produce horns, because dehorning is a very painful and the process does not look good, And so if we can remove the need to dehorn, then we no longer, then this actually improves the overall welfare of dairy cattle. Could be utilized for medical research, such as cattle, for example, that's being modified to produce blood that can be utilized for human transplants. Medical use, organs and tissues. We already use pigs for this concerning heart valves. But could we potentially utilize animals um, to grow other organs, etc., that could be used for medical purposes and for burn victims, etc., things like that. Increased disease resistance. Currently, with the change in climate, we're seeing an increase in diseases, both in human and animal populations. So, can we modify animals to help address or alleviate these disease concerns? And we could help students, we could help species better cope with changing climates as well due to climate change, etc. But there are also potential harms associated with modification, such as that we've been discussing for 20 plus years, such as an potential increase in animal suffering. If there is an off-target mutation, uh, animal welfare could be negatively impacted. Right now, we are further refining our tools, etc., to ensure that off-target mutations are few and far between, at least as we refine CRISPR suites, etc. However, there's still a possibility here. And this is connected to potential impacts to welfare. But also, let's say if we modify an animal to improve productivity, we need to keep an eye on welfare impacts because increasing productivity could bring about some unintended welfare impacts. So again, animal suffering, animal welfare here. Impact to species typical behavior. Are we modifying them in such a way that this might change the types of behaviors that we connect with that type of animal? Could be seen also, and this will come up with a natural debate, what is natural, etc. This could be seen as a violation of species boundaries, especially if we are utilizing genetic material from different species and crossing species lines. So, for example, Aqua Advantage salmon, I believe, includes the genetic material of a type of eel or another type of fish, but I forget exactly specifically uh, the um, fish that they pulled the genetic material from. However, Aqua Advantage has come out and said that they're no longer going to be crossing species lines simply because of the huge amount of consumer pushback and societal pushback for doing so. So there are concerns over whether or not we should be doing that. And wider environmental impacts. Let's say if only 90% of Aqua Advantage salmon or anything else, are sterile, what would happen if there was a gene drift? What would happen if animals were introduced into native populations? There could be negative environmental impacts. So how do we weigh these? So these potential benefits and these potential harms reflect wider views concerning animal welfare and other aspects of life that we value. So let's look at Aqua Advantage, and I've been bringing this up quite a bit because it is probably the most prominent example of animals being modified for human use, at least that's being discussed in the public. So Aqua Advantage, the first GMO salmon, is coming to America. It actually has passed FDA approval. But when we analyze the debate concerning Aqua Advantage salmon from a values perspective, utilizing the list that you guys on Friday put together, we see several categories of concerns. So if we bracket questions concerning scientific efficacy and whether or not applications are valid or invalid, there are typically a broad set of social, political, and economic issues that arise when we talk about whether it's acceptable to modify our breeds and seeds. So there are 5 normative categories of concern typically discussed: impacts to individuals, impacts to society, So impacts to individuals would be like, is your autonomy being respected? In that, do you have a choice about whether or not you buy genetically modified products? Also, what are the health impacts to both individuals and families? Impacts to society. How do these modifications impact our uh, communities, especially when the community economic viability revolves around a particular agricultural product, such as salmon, for example. Impacts to the environment. What would happen if said um, genetically modified organisms are released into the wild? What environmental or ecological impacts would that have? What safeguards are being put into place to ensure that that does not happen? Animal welfare impacts with off target mutations. Discussing that for 20 plus years because we have seen examples of problems in this area. And the wider ontological concerns. Is it natural? Should we be moving genetic material from one species to another? And these are all normative because uh, they focus on what people care about. So stakeholders value individuals. So concerns over health risks, nutritional value, consumer choice are all important. They come to the forefront. They value the environment. So here you're worried about ecological impacts, especially in the Pacific Northwest. In the Pacific Northwest, Washington State was actually the state of Washington. It was actually one of the first states to push back against modifying salmon and to argue that we need to do some more research before we do this. And I believe that's in part due to the fact that salmon play such an important and imperative role in Washington state culture and economic viability. Stakeholders are worried about social change. So, is the food sovereignty of communities being impacted? And what are the risks and benefits, and how are these being distributed? Stakeholders are committed to reducing animal suffering. When you look at the research, over 50% of consumers, even in Texas, and various other places where that have a huge meat industry presence, are worried about animal welfare and animal welfare impacts. Right? So stakeholders are very much committed and focused on animal suffering. Is animal suffering or animal welfare being improved, or is it being harmed here? This is an important question. And the general ontological concerns, impacts to species type, and any violations of species boundaries. All of these highlight what different stakeholder groups and different individuals value. So let's connect these up to the 4 principles that we discussed and have been discussing throughout the semester. So these stakeholder concerns can actually be a sort of grafted onto autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice if we also include impacts to the environment and impacts to animal welfare here. So impacts to the individual, right? Respect for autonomy. Is the autonomy of the individual being respected? Are they given enough information to make choices? Are individuals being benefited, and are they not being harmed? All of those impacts to individuals sort of are encapsulated in those 3 uh, principles. Impacts to society. How are the benefits and harms being distributed across society? Is this an acceptable distribution? Are communities being inordinately harmed without receiving any or few of the benefits? Then we have impacts to the environment, and we can look at, and these connect to ethical principles used in research contexts, as we talked about. How is this modification impacting ecosystem functioning, if at all? How is it impacting native species integrity? And is it maintaining or harming biodiversity? And then our impacts to animal welfare to pull from the 3 pillars of animal welfare. Is animal bodily integrity being maintained? What about quality of life? And are we respecting species typical behavior? So we can connect these stakeholder concerns to wider ethical principles or positions. Now, concerning ontology, and ontology is just a fancy word for categories, like species. Like we divide up the natural world into species groups, and that division is called an ontological division, etc., etc. So I have a video here. I'm not going to show it, but I will put it up for you guys to watch at your leisure. It's another discovery video on what is natural. So what's natural for you? Do you agree with the video that these type of concerns deal with intuitions? And should we take these concerns into account? And do they do any philosophical or bioethical work, any ethical work here? All right. So should we genetically edit animals? And how do we identify, speak to, and or address these value-laden concerns in a constructive way? So I'm actually going to leave you with a video. I'm just going to quickly show some of the modifications that have been recently bringing up discussions in the research context. I'm going to leave you with a couple of other questions, and hopefully you'll discuss them in the discussion forum because there's a lot of rich material here. In fact, this week it's been hard to
comes from a jellyfish. Scientists have
it's been hard to choose which to focus on, at least if I were writing in the discussion forum. Yeah, I'd be like, oh man, I want to talk about designer babies, and cloning is cool too, but and the GMO debate, man, what should I do?
isolated it, pulled it out of the jellyfish, and begun putting it in all kinds of wacky places. And by places, I mean living things. Most recently, a team at the Animal Reproduction Institute of Uruguay made some glowing sheep. They've got GFP all up in their tissue, and they glow under ultraviolet light. Why? Well, no reason really. Honestly, these sheep are more like a scientific proof of concept, but there are other animals that have it for reasons, like these marmosets. Japanese scientists used a virus to put the jellyfish gene directly into monkeys as embryos, and then the virus mutated their DNA. They actually passed the GFP peptide onto their offspring. So these monkeys are used in labs to research infectious diseases and neurological disorders, particularly Parkinson's, because things like tumor cells, genes, and toxins running through a body are all easier to see and study when they glow. GFP is also used in cats to do AIDS research. See, monkeys and cats can both contract a form of AIDS. Both species have these proteins that are called restriction factors that normally defend against viruses, but they're ineffective against HIV or FIV, which is the cat version. So scientists had this crazy idea. What would happen if you gave a cat a monkey's restriction factors? Would a monkey protein fight the feline version of AIDS? So to find out, they made some monkey proteins glow with GFP, and then they put them into some cat eggs, put the cat eggs into a cat womb. Cat gives birth to glowing kittens, and the scientists can actually watch the glowing proteins and see if they were effectively fighting off the virus. And they were. So thanks, glowing animals, because that stuff may be relevant to human AIDS research. In all these cases, it doesn't seem like the GFP causes any change to the animal other than the glow, which, yeah, it's a pretty noticeable change. But in terms of health and behavior, they seem to be exactly the same. You know, I was thinking, so far, all of these animals were created for scientific purposes. I have to wonder, now that somebody's kickstarted a glowing plant for everyone, how long until we see designer glowing pets? And how would you feel if that happened? Let me know down below and subscribe for more D News. I actually would not mind a glowing hand for when I lose things at the bar or under a couch.
Okay, so I'm going to leave you with a couple of questions. So, is this type of modification acceptable? This is clearly for scientific and research purposes. Well, but what about for pets? What modifications do you think are acceptable in your view, and why? What modifications are not? And finally, returning to Aqua Advantage salmon that we've been focusing so much on in this discussion, is Aqua Advantage salmon an acceptable use of biotechnology? So thank you guys very much, and I will see you next week. And I am looking forward to the discussion and to exploring this issue in depth with you.